There have been many shocking and unexpected deaths throughout A Song of Ice and Fire. But one of the most straightforward and seemingly resolved murders is the assassination of Joffrey Baratheon at the Purple Wedding. Littlefinger has directly claimed responsibility and admitted that he colluded with the Tyrells to get rid of Joffrey by using poison hidden in Sansa's hairnet. And the storyline on Game of Thrones was identical and unambiguous regarding what happened when Joffrey was killed. However, this seems like a pretty clear instance where the answers provided by the narrative ultimately don't make a whole lot of sense. The first and most obvious indication that what is directly stated to have happened isn't actually what happened is that Littlefinger and the Tyrells are supposed to be some of the smartest and most politically savvy characters in the series. And the plan that is executed at Joffrey's wedding is both stupid and needlessly complex. Frankly, it seems incredibly unlikely that the Tyrells were even involved in this plot. It's not necessarily because they didn't want Joffrey to die, or that they weren't actively planning on killing him themselves. But the circumstances of Joffrey's death don't really help them and could potentially hinder them in some very obvious ways. It's certainly true that the Tyrells only needed Margaery to marry the king and not Joffrey. But if they were planning on offing Joffrey so Margaery could marry Tommen, it would be far more beneficial for them to do it at a different time and in a different manner. As Cersei herself has already demonstrated, if someone who can get close to the king wants to kill the king, it's not particularly difficult to assassinate him, while at least allowing for some plausible deniability regarding whether or not he was intentionally killed. Yes, there is a marginal advantage to having Joffrey die at the wedding. It prevents Margaery from actually having to consummate the wedding while still being officially married to the king. And if anyone suspects foul play, then there's certainly an endless list of potential suspects. However, the obvious downside there is that if the assassination is an obvious assassination, which is exactly what it winds up being, then the Tyrells are actually pretty close to the top of that list of potential suspects. Killing Joffrey at the wedding could have some silver linings to it, but it also presents a massive double-edged sword for the Tyrells specifically. Firstly, and most obviously, it presents a major problem for them because when Joffrey dies, he is quite literally surrounded by Tyrells. Luckily for them, Cersei immediately blames Sansa and Tyrion. But if any of the Tyrells were actually responsible for Joffrey's death, then being the people who were standing right next to him while he choked out his last breaths seems like an outrageously bad strategy for killing someone and actually getting away with it. And yet, when Joffrey actually dies, Tyrion mentions Margaery, Garland, Olenna, Mace, and Allery all being at the scene. Surely that's to be expected given that Margaery and Joffrey were just married. But if they were aware that Joffrey was about to die, then being in the thick of the crime scene as he dies is one of the dumbest things that they could do. The Tyrells certainly had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Joffrey. But that is essentially why they aren't guilty in this particular circumstance. They had so many different opportunities and ways of accomplishing that goal that it makes absolutely no sense for them to risk their position and endanger themselves to kill Joffrey at a time and in a way that would make them possibly look guilty or weaken their political position. And not only does being the front row spectators to Joffrey's death put them in a really unnecessary position of suspicion, but Joffrey being killed at his own wedding makes it seem like House Lannister is a much weaker, easier target. They're meant to be the most powerful and intimidating family in Westeros. So if their king can be slaughtered so easily, it's a very bad look for them. And given that House Tyrell has just thrown all of their political sway in with the Lannisters, then making them, or their alliance, look so vulnerable that the king could be murdered in the most public way possible really doesn't do them any favors at the time. If they wanted Joffrey dead, there are ways to accomplish that which are much safer for the Tyrells, both in the literal sense and in the broader political sense. Killing Joffrey at the wedding feast also presents another double-edged problem for House Tyrell, and Margaery specifically, because Joffrey is poisoned through his cup of wine, a cup of wine that he's expected to share with Margaery. Interestingly, George R.R. Martin seemingly goes out of his way to mention this when Joffrey is presented with the cup as a wedding gift a mere few hours before he dies. When Mace Tyrell gives Joffrey the gift, Joffrey says, "Margaery and I shall drink deep at the feast, good father." Joffrey lifted the chalice above his head for everyone to admire. And even beyond that, Tyrion makes note of seeing other couples sharing their cups of wine as well. So, the very fact that Joffrey is killed while Margaery is not creates another facet of suspicion surrounding her and her family that's entirely unavoidable. And it's strange that the Tyrells would ever come up with a plan that would so easily cast suspicion upon them. Because regardless of whether or not she was aware of the assassination plot, it would be incredibly easy for someone to assume, especially someone as paranoid and violent as Cersei, that Joffrey died while Margaery lived, because Margaery was somehow involved, or knew it was going to happen. Honestly, the Tyrells actually got incredibly lucky that Cersei was so consumed with the idea that Tyrion was out to get her, because if he hadn't been readily available as a scapegoat, this seems like one of the first questions that she would have asked. Ergo, it doesn't really make sense that the Tyrells would put her in a position to ask it. Ultimately, it's a plot that puts all of the Tyrells at a lot of unnecessary risk. And the risks that they supposedly take in this endeavor just keep on coming. Because the novels aren't exactly subtle about explaining that King's Landing has Tyrells coming out the wazoo in the weeks leading up to the wedding. So once again, if they were truly intending to kill Joffrey, then why not take a page out of the Cersei playbook and use one of the dozens of members of their own family to make that happen, rather than involving Petyr Baelish? When they have dozens of people to plot with, who they can likely trust more than Littlefinger, why involve Littlefinger? Petyr Baelish undoubtedly is not as overtly villainous in the books as he was in the TV series. But the notion that the Tyrells would trust him enough to needlessly involve him in a plot to literally assassinate the king is insane. And it's bizarre that more fans don't question this narrative. If the broadly accepted story is to be believed, then it would mean that Olenna Tyrell and House Tyrell colluded with Petyr Baelish to commit the highest treason in the country against a family whose patriarch is notorious for slaughtering entire houses for rebelling against him. They for some reason thought that Littlefinger was trustworthy enough to partner with in this endeavor, without ever suspecting that this was an incredibly obvious setup to incite them to commit treason. And they actually went through with it, despite the fact that his involvement was completely unnecessary. So it's very, very hard to believe that this is what actually happened. And this line of thought can be taken even further, because although she didn't even know she was involved at the time, another facet of this storyline is that Sansa was unknowingly wearing the poison in her hairnet, because Littlefinger and the Tyrells were intending to frame her for the murder. However, this creates another completely unnecessary link into the poison chain of custody, and once again, doesn't make sense. It actually seems like the safest bet to assume that the entire hairnet theory is nothing more than a red herring, because it is ultimately an incredibly stupid plan that introduces a complete wildcard into the situation when it doesn't even need to exist. It's not as if there aren't 1,000 other ways to sneak a tiny, jewel-like substance into the wedding. And it's a plan that is entirely reliant on every single thing going exactly right in order for it to be successful. The theory is that Littlefinger put the poison into the hairnet, gave it to Dantos, who then gave it to Sansa, who then wore it to the wedding, where Olenna Tyrell grabbed the poison and slipped it into Joffrey's cup. However, if Sansa fails to complete any element of this plan that she isn't even aware that she's a part of, then this plan to literally assassinate the king in the most public forum imaginable doesn't work. Littlefinger and the Tyrells are supposed to be some of the cleverest and most politically savvy characters in the story. So why would they hand off an incredibly deadly poison to a notorious drunk to secretly give to a teenage girl, have that girl promise to wear the hairnet to the wedding, and take that as a guarantee? Assume that no one will figure out that the hairnet isn't actually made of amethysts in the interim. Assume that Sansa will make it to the wedding feast with her hairnet intact. Assume that Lady Olenna will have the opportunity to take the poison from her hair at some point. And assume that no one will actually notice Olenna taking the poison from Sansa's hair. This is a dangerous plan that could literally mean the unimaginably horrific deaths of everyone involved, and it all would have been cut off at the knees if a teenage girl just decided that she wanted to wear something else that day. Or, as she quite literally considers in the morning leading up to the wedding, if she had simply come up with an excuse not to go to the wedding at all. Because before she and Tyrion leave to go to the breakfast before the wedding, Sansa thinks to herself, Sansa was tempted to beg off. I could tell him that my tummy was upset, or that my moon's blood had come. She wanted nothing more than to crawl back in bed and pull the drapes. I must be brave, like Robb, she told herself, as she took her lord husband stiffly by the arm. So, if Sansa had simply decided not to go, then what would have happened? It is unfathomably, and more importantly, unnecessarily, idiotic to literally rest the entire assassination plot on Sansa's unknowing head. It's also very interesting that Sansa seemingly instantaneously figures out exactly what happened as soon as she fled the wedding feast. And not to impugn the reasoning skills of a young girl, but generally speaking, when characters in A Song of Ice and Fire figure out some massive plot in the course of a few paragraphs, they almost always surmise wrong. Literally a few pages earlier, Cersei similarly figures out that Joffrey has been poisoned immediately, but she comes to the completely incorrect conclusion that Tyrion was behind it. So the likelihood that Sansa's off-the-cuff interpretation of what just happened is exactly what just happened seems pretty low. However, in the upcoming chapters, Littlefinger is actually pretty quick to confirm most of Sansa's suspicions, while answering one of her biggest questions as well. Sansa has supposedly figured out that she was the unknowing messenger of this poison, but she was still unclear on who the assassin truly was. After toying with her a bit, Baelish tells her that it was in fact Olenna Tyrell. Now, Petyr Baelish is bizarrely obsessed with Sansa, to be sure. But even taking that into consideration, this entire exchange is very, very weird. If you just abducted a 13-year-old girl that you barely know, why in the world would you explain to her exactly how you and another outrageously powerful family assassinated the king? Why would any remotely rational or intelligent person tell some kid that they committed the greatest crime in the country? Confessing regicide to a teenager that you've just abducted is baffling in general, but it's even stranger when there's no obvious benefit to telling her this information. So that begs the question, what is it that Littlefinger accomplished by telling Sansa? It's confusing on its face, but after thinking it through a bit further, it's actually somewhat easy to see Littlefinger's thought processes and motivations in telling Sansa this story, even though it's very likely to not be true. Sansa is surprised at what Littlefinger has told her, because Olenna seems so sweet and intended to take her to Highgarden and marry her grandson. And Petyr tells Sansa that she was lucky to avoid a marriage with Willis Tyrell. But in reality, Littlefinger already narrowly avoided Sansa being married off to Willis Tyrell, largely by convincing her that the Tyrells were just like the Lannisters, and only trying to marry Sansa into their family because of her claim to Winterfell. Which Littlefinger understandably wanted to avoid, since marrying Sansa off for her claim to Winterfell seems to be one of the keys in his political plans for the future. But Sansa was still aware that the Tyrells were interested in her joining their family, and as soon as Baelish got her out of King's Landing, he essentially told her that the Tyrells had married one of their children to the heir to the throne, and then immediately murdered him because they only needed to marry into his political position. They didn't actually need him personally in order to gain his power. It's not hard to puzzle out where he wants Sansa's mind to go here. She might be a teenager, but it's not hard to understand the between-the-lines implication that if Sansa had gone with the Tyrells, then this would have been her fate as well. She would have married Willis, and then when the family had no need of her and had a strong hold on Winterfell, they would have killed her. Essentially, Littlefinger didn't tell Sansa that he and the Tyrells teamed up to kill Joffrey because that's what happened, but because he wanted her to believe that she had nowhere else to go and no one else who would help her besides him. Regardless of what the Tyrells were after, Sansa was aware that she had some form of a potential lifeline with them, and Littlefinger wanted to make sure that there was no chance that she'd ever use it. He told her this specific lie to ensure that she feels like she has no safe harbor besides him. And at least so far, that seemingly has had the exact effect that he hoped it would, as Sansa does occasionally fantasize about getting away from Littlefinger, but she pushes the thought from her mind because she has nowhere to go and no one else to trust. But if this was all just some big ruse to keep Sansa feeling like she was trapped with Baelish, then what did actually happen with Joffrey? Unsurprisingly, the list of potential murderers is incredibly long. However, the way everything actually played out is a pretty clear indication of who would have done it. Because as should be obvious by now, if the Tyrells wanted to kill Joffrey, they had 1,000 better ways to do it. And frankly, most of the political rivals of Joffrey or the Lannisters had better options to off him as well. There are a number of obvious potential possibilities. It could have been Oberyn Martell. It could have been Varys. But it actually seems quite likely that it truly was Petyr Baelish, because the circumstances of Joffrey's death seem designed to create exactly what Littlefinger has created all along: chaos. Having Joffrey killed at his wedding, when every important and powerful person in Westeros will be present, creates the kind of atmosphere that Littlefinger has constantly thrived in. He has been able to advance himself to an astoundingly high station by pitting powerful people against each other and engendering mistrust among them all. And what better way to ensure that all of the lords and ladies of Westeros are suspicious of each other and ready to tear one another apart than to kill the most powerful man in the world in a scenario where everyone is a suspect? People who intend to commit crimes that they don't want to look like crimes don't commit them in this manner. For the most obvious example, look at the Red Wedding. If someone had simply wanted Robb Stark dead, there were likely a variety of ways to do that. But he was killed in an incredibly public way because the people killing him wanted to make a statement. It was a way of the Lannisters flexing their power and ensuring that everyone in the kingdoms was terrified of that power. And killing Joffrey wasn't just about killing Joffrey. It was about creating a frightening and intimidating event that would have a ripple effect on everyone in the country. It's certainly plausible that someone besides Littlefinger is the one who killed Joffrey. Clearly, he has more than enough enemies that would have loved to see him dead. And perhaps readers will never know for certain how Joffrey died. Or maybe the Tyrell Baelish plot is exactly what happened. But regardless, it's hard to deny that the entire plan that supposedly led to Joffrey's death was unnecessarily risky, stupid, and likely to fail. So either Littlefinger and House Tyrell got incredibly lucky, or Joffrey's assassination came about in an entirely different way. But what do you think? Was it Olenna Tyrell and Littlefinger using Sansa's deadly hairnet to kill the king? Or did something else happen? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.